Made men of the Cosa Nostra believed they were untouchable. They could humiliate anyone, anywhere, and walk away smiling because their title was a shield forged in blood oaths and Italian tradition. But on a cold November night in 1935, one made man learned that some territories don't recognize foreign titles. Some neighborhoods have their own royalty, and some men don't need permission from any commission to execute justice. The Savoy Ballroom was packed beyond capacity that evening. Over 200 souls squeezed into a space designed for half that number. They came for Louis Armstrong, the living god of jazz, who had donated his time for a charity benefit concert. The money raised would buy food baskets for Harlem's poorest families, those who couldn't afford meat for Sunday dinner or milk for their children's breakfast. The crowd was unusually mixed for 1935. Black and white faces united by music, and a rare shared purpose that transcended the rigid racial lines dividing New York City. Armstrong stood on stage in an immaculate suit, his golden trumpet catching the spotlight, as he prepared to play a rendition of what would later become his signature song. The air hummed with anticipation, that electric moment before a master touches his instrument. Then Tommy Marchetti decided to make his mark on history. Tommy the Bull Marchetti had been made 3 weeks earlier by the Genovese family. At 28 years old, he wore his new status like cheap cologne, obvious and overwhelming. The ceremony had taken place in a basement in Little Italy, blood from a pricked finger mixed with the ashes of a saint's image while Tommy swore the oath of Omerta. Now he was untouchable, or so the old men told him. A made man could not be killed without permission from the commission itself. It was the ultimate insurance policy in a world where violence was currency. Tommy arrived at the Savoy with 4 soldiers, all of them drunk on wine and power, looking for entertainment in what they considered enemy territory. They paid for their tickets with crumpled bills and loud laughter, making sure everyone knew Italians had graced this black establishment with their presence. When Louis Armstrong lifted his trumpet to play the opening note, Tommy lifted something else. The beer bottle arced through the smoky air in slow motion, or perhaps that's just how everyone remembered it later. The amber liquid splashed across Armstrong's face mid-breath, soaking his pristine suit, dripping onto his golden trumpet, pooling on the stage floor. The note that should have filled the ballroom died in his throat, replaced by shocked silence so complete you could hear the beer dripping from the trumpet's bell. 200 people froze, their collective breath caught somewhere between horror and helpless rage. Tommy stood near the stage, his arm still extended from the throw, a grin splitting his face like a wound. His voice carried clearly through the silence, each word a deliberate cruelty. "Play faster, monkey. I want to see if you're worth the ticket price." His 4 companions erupted in laughter, the sound obscene in the sacred space where music should have been. Louis Armstrong stood motionless on stage, beer dripping from his chin, his eyes closed as if praying for strength or perhaps dignity, or maybe just for this moment to end. At the back of the ballroom, near the donation table where people deposited their precious dollars and quarters, Bumpy Johnson set down the wooden collection box very carefully. His movements were precise, controlled, the kind of deliberate calm that people who knew him recognized as something far more dangerous than rage. Stephanie St. Clair stood beside him, her elegant dress and diamond earrings marking her as the Queen of Numbers, Harlem's lottery empress. Her hand moved to Bumpy's arm, not restraining but questioning. Junie Bird, Bumpy's most trusted enforcer, was already moving through the crowd toward Tommy, his massive frame parting bodies like a ship through water. But Bumpy raised one hand, palm out, a gesture so subtle most people missed it. Junie stopped immediately, understanding flowing between them without words. The timing wasn't right yet. The stage hadn't been properly set. Violence, when it came, needed to carry meaning beyond simple retaliation. Bumpy Johnson hadn't carried a gun to the charity event. It seemed inappropriate, almost sacrilegious, to bring instruments of death to a gathering meant to feed hungry children. He wore a simple navy blazer and tailored slacks, no jewelry except a wedding ring. No obvious displays of the wealth that flowed through his hands daily from numbers running, loan sharking, and strategic alliances with white gangsters who understood that Harlem belonged to him. At 35 years old, Bumpy had survived longer than most men in his profession by understanding something fundamental about power. True control comes not from the violence you commit, but from the violence everyone knows you're capable of committing. The threat is always more powerful than the execution, because threats can be infinite, while bodies can only die once. But sometimes, rarely, the threat needs to be demonstrated. Sometimes a lesson must be taught in a language so clear that even the stupidest student cannot misunderstand. Without a word, Bumpy handed the donation box to Stephanie. Their eyes met, an entire conversation compressed into a glance. She would handle the money, finish the event however it could be finished, protect the people who had come here expecting safety and music. He would handle what needed handling. Bumpy walked toward the side exit of the Savoy, his pace unhurried, his expression neutral. To most observers, he might simply be stepping out for air, for a cigarette, for any of the mundane reasons a man leaves a crowded room. But Stephanie knew better. Junie Bird knew better. And somewhere in the collective consciousness of Harlem itself, the neighborhood knew that Bumpy Johnson leaving that ballroom meant someone had just signed paperwork they couldn't read. The cold November air hit his face as he emerged into the alley, and Bumpy's mind was already 3 moves ahead, calculating angles and outcomes the way chess masters see entire games before the first pawn moves. 3 blocks north on Lenox Avenue stood a derelict building that officially belonged to the city, seized for unpaid taxes 5 years earlier. Unofficially, it belonged to Bumpy, one of dozens of properties he controlled through intermediaries and shell companies. The basement held several lockboxes containing various tools of his trade, cached strategically throughout Harlem, so he was never more than blocks away from whatever he might need. Bumpy descended the concrete stairs, found the correct loose brick in the wall, retrieved the key, and opened a steel box that most safecrackers would struggle to breach. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, rested a Colt .38 special revolver with a mother-of-pearl grip. He checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, the kind of muscle memory that comes from thousands of repetitions. 6 rounds in the cylinder, mechanism clean, trigger smooth. A quick pause. In this incredible story of Bumpy Johnson, just to invite you, if you enjoy learning more about the American Mafia underworld, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any curiosities. The gun was perfect, maintained weekly whether it was used or not. But Bumpy needed one more element for his plan to achieve maximum impact. Next to the lockbox sat an old ice box, still functioning, kept cold by blocks of ice Junie Bird replaced twice weekly. Bumpy placed the revolver directly on the ice, letting the metal absorb cold until it became something beyond a weapon, became an instrument of psychological warfare. Metal conducts temperature efficiently, and a gun chilled to near freezing carries properties a normal weapon lacks. When pressed against human skin, particularly the sensitive nerves at the back of the neck, cold steel creates instant neurological panic, the body's ancient fear of hypothermia triggering before conscious thought can intervene. The victim feels death's touch before seeing death's face. Bumpy had learned this technique from a Chinese gangster in San Francisco, back when he was younger and still collecting knowledge from every source available. Now he waited, patient as stone, while the revolver absorbed cold, while Tommy Marchetti continued drinking beer at the Savoy, while Louis Armstrong stood humiliated on stage, while the entire neighborhood held its collective breath. 15 minutes later, Bumpy returned to the Savoy through the same side door, the frozen revolver tucked into the back of his waistband, the metal so cold against his skin it almost burned. The scene inside had somehow gotten worse. Louis Armstrong remained on stage, paralyzed by humiliation, beer still visibly staining his suit, his trumpet lying on the floor where he'd dropped it. Tommy Marchetti had returned to his table near the front, his 4 soldiers flanking him like a Roman emperor's guard, all of them drinking more beer, occasionally shouting new insults toward the stage. "Hey, Satchmo, you gonna play or just stand there looking stupid?" Tommy's voice carried that particular cruelty of a bully, who believes himself protected by invisible shields. The 200 witnesses sat frozen in their seats, rage and impotence warring on their faces. Several men looked ready to rush Tommy's table, consequences be damned, but the presence of 4 armed Italian soldiers kept them locked in place. This was how tyranny functioned, Bumpy thought as he moved through the shadows at the back of the ballroom. Not through omnipotent power, but through the credible threat of disproportionate violence. Tommy could humiliate Armstrong because everyone believed that attacking a made man meant death, not just for the attacker, but for his entire family. Bumpy moved like smoke through the crowd, utilizing every shadow, every pillar, every angle that kept him outside Tommy's peripheral vision. He had learned to move this way in the trenches of World War I, where visibility meant death and patience meant survival. The skills that kept him alive dodging German machine guns in French mud now served him stalking prey through his own territory. He circled wide, approaching Tommy's table from behind, where the made man sat facing the stage, his back completely exposed because men who believe themselves untouchable don't watch their backs. Tommy's 4 soldiers were focused on their drinks and their jokes, occasionally glancing at Armstrong's humiliation, like spectators at a particularly entertaining sporting event. None of them saw Bumpy until he was directly behind their boss, the frozen revolver sliding from his waistband with practiced silence. In one fluid motion, born from a decade of violence and survival, Bumpy pressed the ice-cold barrel against the back of Tommy Marchetti's neck. The effect was instantaneous and total. Tommy's entire body locked rigid, every muscle contracting simultaneously as his nervous system shrieked warnings that his conscious mind couldn't yet process. His breathing stopped. His hands froze halfway to the beer bottle. His eyes went wide with animal panic before his brain could identify the specific threat. Bumpy leaned close, his lips almost touching Tommy's ear, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying absolute certainty. Don't move. Don't scream. Don't look back. Because if you do any of those things, I'm going to paint this beautiful floor with your brains, and your 4 friends are going home in bags. You understand? Tommy managed the smallest nod, a bare millimeter of motion, his neck muscles trembling against the cold steel. The 4 soldiers at the table had finally noticed something was wrong, their hands starting to move toward concealed weapons, their faces registering confusion, then understanding, then fear. But Bumpy pressed the revolver harder into Tommy's neck, the frozen metal creating a circle of pain that radiated down the made man's spine. Tell your boys, Bumpy continued in that same deadly whisper, that if any of them moves a muscle, you die first. Then they die, and I won't even need to reload. Tommy's voice came out strangled, barely recognizable. Don't move, nobody move, Jesus Christ, nobody fucking move. The Savoy ballroom had been silent before, but this was a different quality of silence. This was the silence of 200 witnesses watching power dynamics they'd been taught were immutable, suddenly become fluid. The 4 Italian soldiers sat frozen, their hands now visible and empty on the table, their eyes locked on their boss. Slowly, understanding what was happening, they watched as a dark stain spread across the front of Tommy Marchetti's expensive slacks. The smell of fresh urine cut through the beer and cigarette smoke. One of the soldiers opened his mouth, perhaps to say something, perhaps just in shock, but quickly closed it. Tommy the Bull Marchetti, made man of the Genovese crime family, sworn member of Cosa Nostra, untouchable by the ancient rules of the underworld, was pissing himself in front of 200 witnesses while a gun pressed against his neck. The symbolism was almost too perfect, Bumpy thought. The made man who came to demonstrate his superiority, now literally soiling himself, his body betraying him before his mouth could form words. Bumpy kept the pressure constant, letting Tommy's fear marinate, letting every second stretch into eternity. Fear needed time to do its work properly. Fear needed to seep into bones and memory, needed to become the kind of trauma that reshaped a man's understanding of the world. After what felt like hours but was perhaps 30 seconds, Bumpy spoke again, this time loud enough for everyone in the Savoy to hear, his voice carrying clear and cold through the silence. Tommy Marchetti, made man of the Genovese family. You came to Harlem tonight and threw beer on Louis Armstrong during a charity benefit to feed hungry children. So now you have 2 choices, and only one of them lets you keep breathing. He paused, letting the words sink in, letting Tommy's imagination run wild with possibilities. Choice 1. You're going to stand up from this chair. You're going to walk to that stage. You're going to get on your knees in front of Louis Armstrong. You're going to apologize. Then you're going to lick up the beer you threw right off that floor. And after that, you're going to promise, in front of all these witnesses, that you will personally buy and deliver complete food baskets to 100 Harlem families. Choice 2. I pull this trigger and mail your pieces back to Little Italy in a pizza box. You decide. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Tommy's mouth moved, trying to form words, but only a whimpering sound emerged at first. His 4 soldiers remained absolutely still, understanding that their boss's life balanced on a knife edge, and any movement might tip that balance. Finally, Tommy found his voice, and when it emerged, it was high and broken, and nothing like the arrogant tone he'd used to insult Armstrong. Please, God, please don't kill me. I'll do it. I'll do everything you said. Tears started running down his face, mixing with the cold sweat that had broken out across his forehead. I swear on my mother. I swear on everything. I'll buy the baskets. I'll deliver them myself. Just please don't shoot me. The 200 witnesses watched a transformation that shouldn't have been possible by the laws that governed their world. Made men didn't beg. Made men didn't cry. Made men were supposed to face death with omerta silence. But Tommy Marchetti was sobbing like a child, his expensive suit soaked with urine, his reputation dissolving faster than the beer that still dripped from Armstrong's trumpet. Bumpy pulled the revolver back slightly, no longer touching skin but close enough that Tommy could feel its presence like a ghost. Stand up, Bumpy ordered. Tommy's legs shook as he rose, nearly collapsing, the urine stain visible on his light-colored pants, humiliation made physical and undeniable. Walk. Bumpy positioned himself directly behind Tommy, the revolver now pressed into the small of his back, but hidden under Bumpy's blazer, invisible to most observers, but absolutely real to Tommy, who could feel cold steel kissing his spine with every step. They moved through the Savoy like a strange procession, past tables of witnesses who watched with expressions ranging from shock to satisfaction, to something approaching religious awe. The walk to the stage took perhaps 20 seconds but would live in Tommy's memory as an eternal march toward judgment. When they reached the stage, Bumpy's voice was flat and final. On your knees. Tommy Marchetti dropped to his knees on the stage of the Savoy Ballroom, his expensive Italian suit now soaked with urine and stained with the filth of a floor where thousands of feet had danced. He knelt before Louis Armstrong, who stood above him still wearing the beer-stained suit, still holding the dignity that even humiliation couldn't fully strip away. Armstrong's face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, only a kind of weary recognition that justice sometimes comes dressed in strange clothes. Apologize, Bumpy commanded, and Tommy's voice broke completely as he looked up at the man he'd called a monkey 15 minutes earlier. Mr. Armstrong, sir, I'm so sorry. What I did was horrible. It was disrespectful. I'm a piece of shit. I'm garbage. The words tumbled out between sobs, genuine remorse mixed with terror creating something that might have been authentic repentance if it hadn't been forced at gunpoint. I never should have. You're a great man, a great artist, and I'm nothing. Tommy's face contorted with shame and fear and the knowledge that hundreds of people were watching him grovel. Now lick, Bumpy said, his voice carrying no emotion, just inevitability. Tommy stared at the beer-soaked floor, at the liquid that had splashed from his own bottle, now mixed with dust and grime and the accumulated filth of countless shoes. He hesitated for perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, he felt the cold circle of the revolver press harder into his back. Tommy bent forward, his hands braced on the dirty floor, and extended his tongue to the wood. The first lick produced a visible shudder that ran through his entire body. The second lick brought fresh tears to his eyes. The third lick made one of his soldiers turn away, unable to watch. The sound of Tommy's tongue on wood, wet and grotesque, echoed through the absolute silence of the Savoy Ballroom. 200 witnesses watched a made man reduced to something less than human, watched the supposed untouchable Italian nobility degraded to an animal licking spilled beer off a stage floor. Louis Armstrong closed his eyes, not in pleasure at revenge, but perhaps in recognition that this moment had transcended personal injury and become something larger, a statement about power and dignity, and which mattered more when they collided. When Tommy had licked the floor 3 times, Bumpy pulled him roughly to his feet and turned him to face the audience. Bumpy's voice filled the ballroom, carrying authority that needed no amplification. Tommy Marchetti has just promised, under penalty of death, that he will personally purchase and deliver complete food baskets to 100 poor families in Harlem. Every person in this room is a witness to that promise. He has 1 week. Bumpy's eyes swept across the crowd, making sure they understood their role in this moment. If even one family doesn't receive their basket, if even one child goes hungry because Tommy broke his word, then I won't come back with a gun next time. I'll come with a shovel. He turned back to Tommy, whose face had gone pale beyond simple fear into something approaching complete psychological collapse. You understand me, Tommy? 100 families, 7 days, every basket full, every promise kept, because the alternative is worse than death. The alternative is being the man who stole food from hungry children and had to answer to me for it. Bumpy stepped back, lowering the revolver but keeping it visible now, letting Tommy's 4 soldiers see exactly what had been pressed against their boss's spine. Now get out of here, Bumpy said, his voice almost conversational. Take your boys, go back to Little Italy. And every time you even think about coming back to Harlem, every time you consider disrespecting our community again, I want you to remember the smell of your own piss and the taste of that floor. Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He actually ran toward the exit of the Savoy, his expensive shoes slipping on the floor, his urine-soaked pants clinging to his legs, his 4 soldiers scrambling after him like children following a fleeing parent. The door slammed behind them, and for a moment the ballroom remained silent. Then it exploded, but not with applause, with crying. 200 people broke simultaneously into tears, sobs of relief and pride, and the release of 1,000 accumulated humiliations that could never be avenged until tonight. They cried because they had just witnessed the impossible made real, had seen a made man brought to his knees, had watched Italian invincibility shattered by a black man with a cold gun and colder resolve. Louis Armstrong descended from the stage on unsteady legs and walked directly to Bumpy Johnson. Without speaking, the greatest jazz musician in the world embraced the most feared gangster in Harlem. Armstrong's body shook with sobs that came from deeper than tonight's humiliation, came from decades of swallowing insults and smiling at racists and sacrificing dignity to survive in a country that simultaneously loved his music and hated his skin. He cried for every time he'd had to enter through the back door of venues where he was the headline act. He cried for every hotel that refused him a room in cities where thousands paid to hear him play. He cried for every moment he'd been called boy or worse, and had to smile and nod because fighting back meant death or prison or both. Thank you, Armstrong whispered against Bumpy's shoulder, his voice broken. Thank you for defending me when I couldn't defend myself. Thank you for showing them that we matter, that our dignity matters. Bumpy said nothing, just patted Armstrong's back with surprising gentleness. This man who moments ago had held a gun against another man's spine, now offering comfort with the same hands. When Armstrong finally stepped back, wiping his eyes, Bumpy turned to address the crowd. The show continues, he announced, his voice carrying authority that transformed suggestion into reality. Louis Armstrong came here tonight to raise money for hungry families, and that's exactly what's going to happen. The donations continue. We're going to show these Italian visitors how Harlem takes care of its own. He gestured toward the stage, toward the donation box that Stephanie Saint, Claire had been guarding. Dig deep, give what you can. Because tonight isn't just about one man's humiliation. Tonight is about proving that our community protects its own, feeds its own, lifts up its own. Tonight we show the world that Harlem doesn't beg for respect. We command it. The crowd responded like a congregation receiving benediction. Money flowed toward the donation box in amounts that defied the poverty most of these people lived with daily. Quarters and dollars appeared from pockets that often held nothing. Women removed jewelry to donate. Men emptied wallets that would leave them unable to eat lunch tomorrow. By the time the last donation was counted, the collection had tripled what organizers hoped to raise, enough to feed not 50 families but 200, enough to make the humiliation of Tommy Marchetti transform into actual food in actual mouths of actual hungry children. 7 days later, exactly as promised, Tommy the Bull Marchetti returned to Harlem. He came alone in a rented truck loaded with 100 complete food baskets, each one containing rice, beans, oil, sugar, coffee, canned goods, flour, everything a family would need to eat for 2 weeks. The baskets cost him over $3,000 from his own pocket. Money he could barely afford after his recent promotion to maid man came with expensive obligations. Tommy distributed the baskets personally. No soldiers helping, no delegation to underlings. He went door to door to the addresses provided by Stephanie St. Clair's organization, handed each basket to the woman or man who answered, mumbled something that might have been an apology or just embarrassment, and refused to make eye contact. Children watched from windows as the strange white man delivered food and hurried away like a thief running from a crime scene. When the last basket was delivered, Tommy drove the empty truck back to Little Italy and was not seen in Harlem again for the rest of his life. But the story didn't end with Tommy's departure. It spread through the Italian underworld like a plague, mutating and growing with each retelling. The maid man who pissed himself at the Savoy became a legend, a cautionary tale told to young soldiers about what happened when you disrespected territory that wasn't yours. Tommy lost everything that mattered in his world. The respect from other maid men evaporated. The fear that his title should have commanded transformed into mockery, barely concealed behind hands. Within 6 months, the Genovese family quietly demoted him, taking away the protection of his maid status without the formality of a hit, which would have been merciful compared to living as a ghost in the organization that had once elevated him. Tommy became a cautionary tale more valuable alive than dead. A walking reminder that some neighborhoods had their own laws and their own enforcement mechanisms that didn't require approval from any commission. Years later, someone asked Bumpy Johnson why he hadn't killed Tommy Marchetti that night at the Savoy. The question assumed that murder was always the preferred option for a man of Bumpy's reputation. But Bumpy understood something more sophisticated than simple violence. Dead, he would have been forgotten in a week, Bumpy explained, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had spent decades studying how power actually works. The Genovese family would have made him a martyr, maybe even used his death as an excuse to start a war. But alive and humiliated, living with the memory of pissing himself in front of 200 people. Alive, he became a lesson that every maid man remembers. Bumpy lit a cigarette, the smoke curling between them. In Harlem, we protect our people, we defend our dignity, we enforce our own justice, and anyone who forgets that doesn't die. They learn to live on their knees, which is a far worse fate for men who pride themselves on standing tall. The revolver Bumpy used that night was never fired. He kept it in a special box, stored on ice in the same basement lockbox where it had waited that November evening. The gun became something more than a weapon, became a symbol, a totem, a physical representation of the moment when Harlem proved that Italian invincibility was a myth that could be shattered by one cold barrel and colder resolve. Whenever young soldiers got cocky, whenever Italian gangsters forgot the boundaries of Bumpy's territory, someone would tell the story of the maid man and the frozen gun. They would describe the sound of urine hitting the floor, the sight of a man licking beer off a stage, the absolute humiliation that was somehow worse than death because you had to wake up and live with it every day. The story became legend, and the legend became law, an unwritten rule that everyone who operated in or around Harlem understood. Bumpy Johnson's territory was sovereign ground, and disrespect carried consequences that maid status couldn't protect you from. Louis Armstrong never spoke publicly about that night, maintaining the dignified silence that had protected him through decades of navigating racist America. But people close to him knew that something changed after the Savoy incident. He carried himself differently, stood a little taller, smiled a little less apologetically when white venue owners or promoters made demands. The humiliation had been erased not by his own hand, but by someone who understood that sometimes an individual's dignity represents an entire community's worth. Armstrong continued playing benefits for Harlem charities, and Bumpy Johnson attended every single one, always dressed simply, always staying in the background, never seeking credit or recognition. Their connection transcended words or public acknowledgement. It existed in the silent understanding between two men who knew that power meant nothing if it didn't protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The 100 families who received food baskets from Tommy Marchetti's humiliation never knew the full story. They knew only that somehow, mysteriously, a truck appeared with food when they needed it most. Some heard rumors about what happened at the Savoy. Some connected dots between the charity concert and the sudden appearance of provisions, but most simply accepted the gift with the weary gratitude of people who had learned not to question unexpected blessings in a world that rarely offered them. Those baskets fed children who might have gone hungry. They provided meals that mothers didn't have to skip so their babies could eat. They represented something more valuable than the sum of their contents. They proved that justice, real justice, could transform humiliation into sustenance, could make power serve poverty rather than crush it. The food eventually ran out, as food always does. But the memory of that night lingered in Harlem's collective consciousness, a story passed down through generations, mutating slightly with each telling but always retaining its essential truth. Bumpy Johnson made a made man kneel, lick, and cry, and then transformed that moment into food for 100 families. That was power that meant something. If you enjoyed our content, consider clicking the button. New exclusive stories every day.